We're going to go ahead and begin. I'm Charlotte Webb. I'm the Coordinator of Elementary Education in the Office of Early Learning at the Department of Ed. And thank you for joining me. This is going to be the first of 7 webinars that are specific to reading instruction. So this first one, as you can see from the title, is going to be an overview. We're going to be looking at what does a balanced reading diet look like? What are the components? What needs to be happening in the reading classroom each day? And then what are some ways to make that happen? What are some strategies that I can use to help support my own professional practice? Each of you are muted, but at the end or even as we go through, if you have questions, if you wouldn't mind to type them in the chat box, and I'll try to stop periodically and answer those. The webinar is being recorded. As soon as we finish and it gets transferred into the right format, it will be posted on the tree on the West Virginia Teaching Resources for Educator Excellence website, and I'll show you where to find that as well. Our goals for today are, we're first going to look at what is a balanced literacy diet. I find that there's often some confusion between what we mean when we talk about literacy and what we mean when we talk about a balanced reading diet. And then we're going to just review some instructional strategies that may help you in your practice. And just taking a look at some data. I know that none of us would argue that we have a lot of work to do to support our children in West Virginia in terms of them being able to read proficiently, especially reading proficiently by grade level. And for those of you who've been with me before in presentations, I've shared this a lot, but I just think it's sobering when we look at this, that in 2013, we see what the average score on the NAEP test was of our West Virginia students, and that was lower than the national average. That the average score for students in West Virginia was not significantly different from the average score in 2011 or in 1992. So looking at the first thing, of course, is disappointing that we're lower than the national average, but looking at the second and knowing that really in 20 years we have not made a significant difference in our children being able to read proficiently. Same with the next one. The score gap between the higher performing students and the lower performing was 46 points. Again, not significantly different from 1992. The percentage of students in West Virginia who performed at or above the proficient level was 27%. Looking at that again, not significantly different from 1992. And the percentage of students in West Virginia who performed at or above the basic level was 62%. And again, not significantly different. So in each of those areas, you know, one of the things that really struck me when I first took this job, when I would ask people, you know, well, what do you think the problem is? Why do you think our children are struggling to read? And I just found that everybody had their own view of what the problem was. And it usually had to do with somebody else. So usually I would get responses like, well, if the governor would just blank, or if the legislators would just, you know, allot more money, if the State Board of Education would just, if the Department of Ed would just, if teachers would just, if parents would just. So there was a lot of different views. The thing they had in common, though, was that it was always about somebody else. Now, I've been a teacher for many, many years, and I can tell you, I so get that. I get that frustration about there are so many things that are outside of my control when I get those babies in my classroom. That is, you know, um, I wouldn't hesitate to, recognize that that is frustrating. You know, it is frustrating when you get those babies that have parents that maybe aren't as engaged as we think, or we don't have the resources that we need. But one of the things I feel like has just been my call to battle since starting in this position is that there are so many things that we can't control, so many things that are outside of our sphere of influence. But there are so many things that are in our control. And so if one of the things I can encourage you just as we move forward in the webinar today is just to think through. It's hard, I know, to not to focus on all those other obstacles that you face. But if you can just think through, I don't have control over that, but here's what I can do. And I'm going to focus on what I can do. And I'm just going to give the best to what is in my sphere of influence, and just trust that that's going to make a difference in the lives of these children. Now, I have one person who says they were not able to hear. Is everyone able to hear? Or if somebody can just type in and let me know that you can hear. I'm not sure if it's just that one. Oh, good. Well, some of you can hear. That's lovely. Lots of you can hear. All right. Let's take a look at what the importance of literacy is. Literacy really is the foundation upon which all of our learning takes place. And I know when, right when I started in this position was right when the Next Gen standards were being implemented. There was a lot of confusion about the responsibility of all of us to implement those literacy standards and being able to support literacy in our own content area. And I had one precious teacher who taught middle school science, and she said, I've stopped teaching science. And I said, why? Why have you done that? And she said, because I'm spending all my time trying to learn how to teach reading. And I said, well, I love that. I mean, I appreciate that you're doing that, but I said, if you don't teach science, who's going to? So we are counting on those of you in your content areas to teach that content. And there's a real difference in being able to support literacy in your content area and teaching reading. And hopefully we can clear some of that up today and just make sure that's not confusing. So when we think about literacy, literacy really is the ability to receive information, whether by looking at our standards for reading and listening, or to share out that information by writing and speaking. And really the whole purpose is just to be able to connect with others and with our world in a meaningful way. So let's take a look at this graphic, the balanced literacy diet. If you look at the graphic, you can see the circle in the middle. It's made up of 4 equal parts, and those, of course, are our standards: the reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and language. And you'll see right in the center of that circle the arrows that are just showing that continuum of going around. And I think that's really important because we do tend to focus on reading. We hear a lot about reading. We talk a lot about reading instruction. But the truth is they're all very dependent on each other. So we really can't have one happen successfully without all of them happening successfully. I think, though, the reason that we do hear so much and talk so much and think so much about reading is if you'll take a look at those clusters and objectives, there are a lot more there. There just is a lot more stuff that we have to address when we are working on those reading standards. Now this one I think probably sums it up a little better, because we're all working towards that reading comprehension, which of course is at the peak here of our shape. But you can see all those other things that go into that. So we talk about reading comprehension as if it is one thing, but oh my goodness, look at all the things that go into it. Children having to, very beginning, having to know concepts of print. Which way does the book go? How do I hold it? Reading from left to right. Phonemic awareness. What makes this word different from this word? What is it I'm hearing that's different about these two words? To building vocabulary and learning about text structures. And so it's really a complex practice. And those of you who have been at it a while, or maybe those of you who have even just started this year, probably have very quickly learned, oh my gosh, there's a lot to this. There's a lot that has to happen in order for reading comprehension to take place. One of the resources that I've used a lot in my practice, and we'll talk about some other resources too, but this one, Words Their Way, I have found to have just a good comprehensive look at the developmental way that children learn to read and write and learn about spelling and phonics and vocabulary building, and has a lot of good information in it. And some of the things that I'm going to use today in the webinar came from this. One of my favorite quotes from this book is by Donald Vayer, and he talks about that when we conduct word study with our students, really that's addressing needs in a whole lot of areas and supporting literacy development kind of across the board. And what he calls that is the synchrony of development. And all that means is that all of those things work together in sync, or develop almost simultaneously. So as they're learning to read, you see a difference in their writing, you see a difference in their spelling. You'll even see, those of you who have the tiny babes, you know that it even changes their drawing. Their drawing changes as they become more proficient in their writing or their spelling or their reading ability. So it's really interesting and fascinating, I think, as we see how those children develop over time, and how even their, one other thing that you probably noticed too is their physical development. Being able to cross that midline, being able to skip. Boy, when they get to the place where they can skip, they skyrocket in the development of these other areas, because that brain development is, so closely tied to those gross motor skills and their reading ability. And we're going to look at, in this overview, we're going to look at 3 different types of readers. And my hope is you can find these little diets, this little graph, and you can find a lot of different people who have them out there. So I'm certainly not saying this is the one that everybody needs to use, but this is one that I'm familiar with, and it deals with 3 different types of readers. The first one is an emergent reader, or a pre-reader. And if you'll take a look down through there at each of those instructional goals, we've got concept of word, concept of print, alphabet, phonological awareness, and language play and writing. But I want you to take a look over in the far right-hand column at the time spent. Because one of the things I want to be really clear about is there isn't a specific amount of time that has been put in there, because, different schools, different counties have allotted all different times. I know I've heard a lot of feedback from you all about, during Reading First, it was that 90-minute block, and sometimes that message got really messy and not very inviting to people who were participating in it, perhaps. So rather than thinking about a specific number of minutes or hours or whatever, think of it in terms just of a percentage. And with these emergent readers, with these early children learning to read and just kind of how to navigate the code that we use in order to read, it's really important that they're having equal amounts of time in each of those areas. So we really have to just give them a lot of time in each one of those areas in order for them to experience and, you know, try to learn how to facilitate this new knowledge that they're gaining. And we're going to look through each one of these parts and what that talks about. But one of the other things that I'd like you to notice is, if you'll see the very top one, the concept of word, this is the determining factor that determines a student's progression to being the next leveled reader or a beginning reader. And concept of word, probably you're already familiar with this, but concept of word just has to do with understanding the match between speech and print. And let me show you what that looks like.
Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow.
Now, did you see that? Did you see what happened? How the child was tracking along word for word, and then he...
And Tim, why don't you raise your hand and tell me...
Oh, oops, sorry, wait.
What letter this is?
I didn't turn it off.
What letter is it? Good.
My apologies. But you can see that what happened to that child was tracking along fine, and then all of a sudden they lost their ability to track because they got confused with the syllables. Oh, yikes. I'm going to make you feel so good about yourself because I mess up a lot on these webinars. So you'll just leave feeling like you're the grandest thing ever, and you are. So concept of word. The next one, of course, is concept of print. Just understanding how language works. That was kind of one of the things that we talked about at the beginning, was, you know, which direction do I hold the book? You know, knowing what's right side up, knowing what's the front of the book, knowing that I read from left to right, and, you know, how to place the letters when I'm writing on the paper. That's what we talk about with concept of print. Now, with alphabet, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about phonemic awareness and phonics. And one of the things, again, for those of you that have the younger children that have these emergent level readers, as you think about your ABCs, I know when I taught kindergarten, we had 26 weeks of our instructional time devoted to every single one of those letters. We had, you know, puppets that went with each one, and I'm not saying it was a bad process at all. I mean, I know that my children learned a lot. They enjoyed the activities that we did. But one of the things I would invite you to think about is it doesn't necessarily have to be a 26-week process. Or within 26 weeks, you don't have to just focus on one letter at a time. If you'll look down at the third bullet, the way children learn, how they learn developmentally is, the first thing that they can hear are those letter sounds that are at the beginning of the letter name, like B, B. So the first sound is also at the beginning of the letter name, B, D, J, K. The next thing as they progress developmentally, they're able to start hearing the sounds at the end of the letter name. And you'll see they do this with words too. They begin hearing the first sounds first, then they begin hearing the last sounds in a word. So the letter sound that's at the end of the letter name, like F, you don't hear the sound until the end of the letter. And I'll tell you, these next ones, using but confusing, that's exactly the terminology I use with them. I'm like, oh gosh, guys, these letters, they don't follow any of the rules. They are, they really are hard to remember. Some of these we just kind of have to memorize because they don't fit the way we sorted our other letters. For example, with G or W, you've probably seen children who will they'll know that it's the W, but they're thinking that has the D sound. Or for Y, Y, they'll put the W down. So those are tricky for them, and I let them know right up front. They are tricky, and we're going to have to work really hard on these. And then they begin hearing those middle sounds with their short and long vowel sounds. So again, that's just a suggestion that you might want to think about, because sometimes you can take them even further when you will sort those letters or group them according to the way those sounds are presenting themselves in the letter. And, just so we're clear about the difference in our phonics and phonological awareness. And phonological awareness really is that auditory part, that our children have to be able to discern the difference auditorily between those sounds that they're hearing, like the D in dice and the R in rice. Those are the letters that change that word. But if they can't hear that, and I've had children who were struggling readers that we have found out, as we were working and providing interventions, and ultimately we found out that they would have an auditory processing difficulty. So, sometimes that can be an obstacle that children face, and this is how you find that out, or this is an indicator of knowing that about your children. So one of the things I do to try to make sure that I know that they're hearing the sounds correctly is I always start with a picture sort. When we're learning new sounds, whether they're it's the beginning of the word sound or end of the word, I want them just saying the sounds and sorting them by what they hear rather than what they see. And even up through, third and fourth grade, even when I was working with those, multisyllabic words, I still had them sort with picture sorts because I needed to know they could discern the differences in what they were hearing and then start looking for the patterns in what they saw about the way those words were put together. And then with writing, writing really, at the beginning, is just about letter formation and starting to make those letter and sound associations. You're really just trying to help them tell their story, help them get that down on paper. And here are some examples I have that I thought were cute. If you'll look at that first one, all the birdies, you can tell, this is right at the beginning of an emergent reader, and you're just seeing scribbles. You see some things that might be the beginnings of letters, but you don't see anything definitive that is looking recognizable. But what is neat, and if you've taught this age group or with this age group, what's really cool about this is they know exactly what they mean by this, and they will dictate that to you. And that's a really good idea, to write that out for them when they can tell you what it is they're drawing or what it is they're trying to represent on paper, and you write it out for them. But don't forget that final step. You, as they dictate it and you write it out on their papers, go back and have them read it aloud to you while they still have it, in their mind. Help them, show them, you're giving them that concept of word, all the birdies. So as you have them reread that to you, it's really supporting their development. Now take a look at that next one with the cowboy. You can see how even the drawing is different. We still don't have really recognizable letters, but we are starting to see squiggles that look more intentional about what they're trying to represent. But you see, they've got legs and a hat, a cowboy hat. And again, they're able to dictate exactly what it is they mean by this representation, and so you help them get that down on paper. But now look at C. Look what Cameron's done down here. If you couldn't even see the letters, you can tell by the drawing that this is a more mature reader, because just you start seeing the details. Look at those fingers. There's quite a few on one hand, and I don't know, not so many on the other. But you see that they're starting to pay more attention to those details, even in their drawing as well as in their writing. And when you see now, look at, they've got some really clearly written letters, and you can start to see that they are hearing sounds. So what they're trying to represent is jasmine, and you can see several of those sounds have been represented on their paper. What I think is funny is sometimes when they are practicing that stretching out the word so they can hear each of those sounds, they'll put too many letters, because like if you say jasmine, a lot of times they'll put like a short vowel sound at the end where they're trying to stretch it out, and it actually sounds like another letter to them. And then at that last one, you can see now that there are, clearly written words, whether they're doing that by what they're able to sound out or they're using environmental print. They obviously have a concept of word now, knowing that there are letters that are put together to make words. So once they have that concept of print, then the next type of reader that you would encounter would be this beginning reader. So if you take a look at it, you'll see that our instructional goals have changed. Now we've got fluency, we've got word study, we've got comprehension and writing. And take a look at the time spent. You see now that it's not equal amounts of time for each one, that the focus becomes fluency. And it's during this time that fluency becomes critical, because until they build that fluency, they really can't progress into the next leveled reader, which is a transitional reader, because they're just using too much of their brain capacity trying to sound out each letter and each part of the word and put the words together. It's just taking too much brain capacity to sound out, that they're not going to be able to make meaning until they have that fluency in place. So that's the critical piece, and we'll talk a little bit about how to support that. Now, as you think about fluency, if your children are like mine, and I talked about fluency, they only knew one thing that meant. I want to read fast. I want to read faster and faster. And I have used a strategy before where I would have them graph, like I could read this many words in a minute, now I can read this many words in a minute. And that's a fine strategy, to encourage them about getting faster. But what you want to make sure that they know is it's not really just about speed. It has to do with accuracy, and it has to do with the development of prosody. And all prosody means is their reading should sound very natural. So it's not necessarily that it's fast, but it sounds very conversational. So their reading flows in a very normal conversational manner. Now, that's what gets tricky about that speed, because I've had some children that had really, drawn out more country accents, and even in their conversation, they spoke more slowly than, my other children. So I'm not trying to get them to read as fast as everybody else in the room. I'm trying to get their reading to sound natural and sound conversational. And so one of the ways that you can do that is by having them record themselves reading and then listen to a fluent reader read that same section of text. And let them compare. Don't be afraid to let them say, wow, that other one, mine doesn't flow like that. Mine doesn't sound uh, as good as the other one. Don't be afraid to let them have that struggle, because that's what will support their learning. Here's what I'm working towards. This is an exemplar. This is where I'm headed, and how I want my reading to change. Some strategies for fluency, again, are those timed repeated readings, paired readings. This is really good. If you have those volunteers that come into your class and want to help a student or volunteer with a student, sometimes like the big brothers and big sisters, paired reading is a great way to kind of provide an intervention without them knowing that there's an intervention, because what can happen is the adult can be reading along, and when the child feels comfortable, the child just takes over. So it's not like this is my page, this is your page. The child gets to determine that. So it's a win-win, because they're hearing a fluent reader read, and they're also deciding, I think I can read this part, and getting to take over and practice their own reading at the same time. Reader's theater, I can't say enough about Reader's Theater, and I just talked to a lady yesterday who, that's a big part of their summer learning opportunities that they have, is they have, rather than like summer school per se, they have Reader's Theater. And so the children are practicing these different plays, they're designing the backdrops, the scenery, putting together costumes, and just sounded really exciting. And children will read a Reader's Theater like, 100 times without getting tired of it, because they are committed to doing it correctly and sounding like that character. And it doesn't feel like a punishment. It doesn't feel like, oh, I must not be doing very good. It's really just a very respectful way to give them an opportunity to read and reread text for a purpose. Not just, here, I need you to do it again because you didn't do it right the last time, but it's very purposeful. And again, just very respectful. Have an expert reading. We would do this once a week in my class. One of the children would pick a book. They knew what day, they were the expert, and they would work so hard preparing to be the reader for that day for our class, to get to read aloud to the class. And again, it was purposeful, so they didn't feel like the work didn't seem so taxing as they were preparing to read aloud to their friends. They were motivated because they wanted to do well. Poetry reading, that was the way I did a lot of my timed repeated reading, because for me that really dealt with two different things. One, it was a short amount of text generally, gave them an opportunity to read that short amount of text to gain fluency. But boy, poetry really lent a lot to their just being able to hear the sounds and learn about rhyming and learn about the tempo that needs to happen in reading. So poetry reading has a lot of really good benefits that you can use. And then the last one, singing songs. There is research out on this now about how singing songs is just helping a lot of children skyrocket in their fluency. And the reason behind it is similar to the poetry, is hearing the song, hearing the tempo helps keep them on track and helps them be able to follow along more easily because of the music behind it. Now, let me tell you one caveat about that. If you choose to do singing songs or having some type of a music camp as an intervention, one of the things, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to tell your students, you know, this is only going to help you become a better reader if you're following along with the words. Because, of course, they, like us, you know, hey, I know these words and I'm just singing along. And that's fine, but that's not going to increase their fluency if they're not focused on the words and training their eyes to move along with that regular tempo. That's the value of singing songs to develop fluency. And then with this type of reader, the word study is beginning to sort words by their beginning sounds, short vowel families, and then those short and long vowel sounds other than just the rhyming words and the vowel families. There's several different ways to do these sorts. One, like I showed you, were the picture sorts. And then once I did the picture sorts, then I would actually give them the words written on cards and have them sort by, now you've sorted by what you've heard, now sort by what you see. What kinds of patterns do you see in the words? And, you know, letting them then discern visually what's different about these words. Buddy sorts, again, are just when they're working with a partner and sorting those together. Written sorts are, I guess you could secretly call these a spelling test. We would do written sorts at the end of the week. But when I had them do those written sorts, they still were sorting them on their paper. So whatever their guide words were, you know, whatever the words were that they were sorting under, then they would physically do that on their paper too. So this word belongs over here, this word belongs over here. And speed sorts were their favorite. We would do these a lot of times in small groups, you know, 3 or 4 children together, just standing up back to back. I would have them just bend down, turn all their words face down, and, you know, when I would say go, then they would sort them. First person that got them would stand. It was just a lot of fun and for them, and a fun way for them to practice, you know, looking at the words and working with them. And then with comprehension, of course, this is when they start using those cueing systems, being able to predict what they think would come next, what would make sense in this sentence, cross-checking what they're thinking. This is where your close reading would come in, building vocabulary and becoming familiar with concepts. Now, as we take a look at vocabulary, I show this slide in nearly every presentation I do because I am just blown away by this research that says when it comes to risk factors for vocabulary development, poverty trumps everything. Look at that. It trumps your ESL students. It trumps children with language impairments. And really the reason for that is because generally those children that come to us who are living in poverty do not have the experiences, do not have the access to text, and really have not had the opportunity to engage in those meaningful exchanges and conversations that the children who are not living in poverty. And look at this. By the time those children, our low-income children, come to us in pre-K or kindergarten, they come to us having heard 30 million fewer words. That is a significant gap. Now, it doesn't mean they know 30 million fewer. It just means that they have heard 30 million fewer words than children who are not subjected to poverty. Taking a look at our own statistics from West Virginia, for our students, we have, I think there's a little more this year, this was last year's data, 267,000 students. Of those, look, over half are low SES or are living in poverty. Uh, you'll notice that 20% in the orange circle are students with disabilities. And then right there in the middle, you have a little over 10% that struggle with both. So not only are they living in poverty, missing out on those experiences and meaningful exchanges, they also are struggling with some sort of a disability. But here's where we go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, just knowing what you can control and what you can't. I have met some of the most kind-hearted, generous teachers who are bringing in food for their children. They're bringing in gloves and coats and supplies and backpacks and making sure that they have everything that they need. And I love that. I love the heart and the intent behind that. But one thing we really have to guard against is we know that they are struggling with poverty. We get that. But it's another thing when we start letting that guide our thinking. Because sometimes poverty is really about something bigger than just a lack of economic wealth in our homes or our families. Sometimes it becomes what we believe. It becomes what we believe about ourselves. It becomes what we believe about our children, what we believe about the possibilities for them. So again, that's just one thing that I would caution you to guard against. Just continually looking at how you're thinking about the children in your classroom and making sure that you're keeping those high expectations even though you know what struggles they're facing. And then with these beginning readers, when they're writing to use sound. So they're actually starting to put their ideas down on paper, not just through pictures, but actually using letters to represent what it is they want to say. And here's one example. You can see two different children who have written the very same thing. And you'll see at the top, I like housekeeping. And you can see that all those letters are put together. So I think it would be safe to assume, the one on top doesn't have that concept of word. So we know that that child would be an emergent reader. But boy, down at the bottom, we can see now that that child does have a concept of word. And we see those spaces in between the words. And look at that, housekeeping. That's exciting. If you've taught them at that age, you know that that's pretty exciting to see them be able to hear and distinguish that many sounds. Now let's just take a look at the shifts, because I know that there were a lot of things that changed with the implementation of the next gen standards, but some of them probably you already had going on in your classroom. I know that when I first started teaching in third grade, I was really bad about choosing the books and the stories that I loved, the ones that meant a lot to me, that I thought had the beautiful pictures, and I really did not realize how important it was for me to also include a lot of informational text in my classroom. And I started seeing this some with my boys, but I certainly don't think it's limited to just our boys, like in the informational text. All children love that. They love the real books with the real pictures about animals or about vehicles or about space or flowers, plants, whatever it is. They really enjoy that informational text. And so in the elementary school, of course, it ought to be a 50-50 split. And then when you look at the types of writing, same with the others. It should be a split between each of those. So the argument, informational or explanatory, and narrative. And I know in my own practice when I first started, I had them write a lot of narrative. You know, tell me about your weekend. Tell me about your whatever it was. Just having them write stories. And I didn't focus a lot on those others. And one of the things that I found, especially with my children that came from an impoverished background, they had a hard time writing that narrative part. Now, they could do a little better when I would say, tell me which of these two stories you like better, and they could, define their argument about this one or this one. But with a narrative, a lot of times they don't have stories to tell, and they'll sometimes look at you with just a blank look and like, I don't know what to say, and they're telling the truth. I don't think they're just trying to get out of work. They honestly have not had those engaging conversations that have given them the words that they own in order to put them into their own personal narrative. And so again, we see that writing remains pretty equal. So the narrative's 35, the explanatory's 35, and then the argument's 30 in the elementary grades. And then the final type of reader is our transitional or instructional reader diet. And if you take a look at that, you remember that in the one before, fluency was the key. That was the one that once they were a fluent reader, that's what pushed them into this next level of being a transitional or an instructional reader. And so now you'll see that the time spent is more focused on the comprehension. So we're not working so much on fluency, but we are still working on fluency. We're still working on word study. We're still working on writing. But the majority of our time is spent around that comprehension. So giving them time to do those reading and thinking activities, graphic organizers, close reading, whatever types of strategies that you're using to support comprehension. And those are the things that we can do across the content, helping them build vocabulary and helping them build knowledge. Now, here's one thing that I would like for you to think about, because this, if you are a kindergarten, first or second grade teacher, I know that you've heard about the early learning reporting system. Kindergarten teachers are already having to do report on their children in the system, and so there's always a big question about, is the early learning reporting system a test? No, it's not a test. It's just a platform where you can put in your data that you have collected from doing some type of an assessment, a formative assessment with your children. And so as you start thinking through assessment, I'm sure you all have heard, just like I, about the federal push to assess less. Hey, I'm all for that. I'm all for that. But just know that in order for us to know how to design instruction to support our children, we do have to have something in place to collect evidence about where they are and what I, as their teacher, needs to do to move them to the next level or move them closer to mastery on a standard. So as you think about assessment, what I'd like for you to do is think about your current practice. Just right where you're sitting or tomorrow, think through all the assessment tools that are used, either in your county, in your school. You might have your own that you've designed in your classroom that you do in addition to all these others. And as you are writing all those, I want you to think about, what makes sense? one, how often is it used? How often am I using this tool? What evidence does it give? And I would encourage you, as you think about what evidence you can gather from that, thinking through what standards are supported. So I'm gathering evidence to support which standards. Because sometimes we'll have a tool that will only give me evidence about, one standard or just a couple of standards, when there might be another tool that, gosh, with that one tool, I can get evidence about numerous standards. And so that might be a better choice to use. And then what happens with that evidence once it's collected? If I'm just putting it in the ELRS, or I'm just, turning it in to my principal or the county, well, that's really not a good use of anybody's time if it doesn't support what I'm going to do for my children. If it doesn't guide my instruction, it doesn't help me decide, where are the gaps and what can I do to support those. That's really what about collecting that evidence is about. And same, just going back to that one, even looking at this one piece of writing, I can get a lot of evidence. What sounds they're hearing, they have a concept of word. With this bottom one, I can see, gosh, I need to work on capitalization, punctuation, start teaching them about sentence structure. So there are a lot of things that I can get even from these, very informal opportunities to collect evidence. And a lot of times these can be very authentic if you have learning centers or activities going on in your room, that you can collect them really without the children even knowing you are. You're just gathering evidence as you look at what they're working and the work that they're producing. So consider some considerations about this. And this one goes right back to what we've been talking about all through this when we think about, especially about our children of poverty. How do I, as a teacher, demonstrate value and respect for all students? If you're familiar with Dr. Marzano's work, he describes this as identifying those high expectancy and low expectancy students. And just to be clear, that term low expectancy really has nothing to do with the students. So it's not like I'm saying, oh, that one won't amount to anything, or gosh, that student will never be able to be successful. It doesn't have anything to do with the students. It has to do with my perception as a teacher. A really easy way for you to determine, if this is an issue for you, is what I would do is I would just take a clipboard, something with a list of my students' names, and I would just walk up and down, around their tables or their desks. And for each one, as I would look at them, I would just, in my mind, in my heart, say, what is my expectation for this child to achieve and be successful with reading or math or, whatever standards that we are looking at. And I would just intuitively know that, gosh, sometimes these things would come up in me about I knew their parents, or I'd had siblings. I knew what situations were going on at their home, and I had taken those things that I knew, that knowledge that I had, and allowed it to shape my thinking, rather than just choosing to start from a different point. One of the things that I say in all my trainings is your beginning point is going to determine your ending point. So if you start from a place of low expectancy or acceptance of meager possibilities, then you're going to end up a place that you really don't want to be. But boy, if you can start from a of, I might be the only one that can make a difference in this baby's life, and I'm going to give it my all. I'm going to give it everything I have and just, encourage him and help him be just as successful as he can be without allowing these other things to cloud the way I'm thinking or the expectations that I have. And then just some other considerations too as you go on are begin and end with your standards. Your standards always are what's most critical. We're always working towards mastery of the standards, whatever they may be. And that's just all I have to say about that. But we always begin and end with our standards. And know that we're working towards mastery. It's very similar to when you think about when you went to get your driver's license. How many times did you get to take that test? As many as it took. And I can tell you, I've got 4 children, and 2 of them I had to make several trips back to the Department of Motor Vehicles so they could take and retake that test, which should make you feel very comfortable out driving, knowing that they're out there. But that's exactly the way we have to think about our standards. Our children have to move towards mastery. So it's not like I can cover long vowel sounds in October and November, and now I'm finished with those. I'm moving on to something else. If my children haven't mastered that, I can't move on. They're not going to be able to be successful on the things past that if they haven't achieved mastery on those skills. Now here are some sample resources. Again, there are piles of them out there. These are just some that I'm familiar with. Running records, a lot of your counties are using that now. There's a PALS, which is a phonological awareness literacy screening. Does very simple things to the running records. QRIs, Book Buddies, Dibbles. And I know a lot of these are already in place in your counties. One of the ones I just like to point out, because I know a lot of counties, spend quite a bit of money on some type of assessment for teachers to use. Running records are free, and you are able to get a lot of information just from doing a running record. You can assess their fluency. You can assess their, concept of print, concept of word, what sounds they're familiar with, what sounds are they using but confusing, what types of words are they struggling with as they're reading. And any type of assessment that you do, I'll just encourage you to be the one that does it with them. I know at one school where I worked, our school would hire a substitute to come in they would give us 2 half days. The sub would stay in our room, and we would do the assessment on our children. But boy, some of the teachers in other grade levels would have the sub do them, and I just never understood that, because I felt like I wanted to hear it. I wanted to know what mistakes they were making. I wanted to know for myself where they were and what they were going to need to move forward. If you're not familiar with running records, I will tell you can go right to YouTube and search for that. There are lots. I mean, there are like modules that you can go through that tell you every part of the process. You could even do a on it at your school or with your PLC. Now, I'm going to take just a minute here. If you have any questions, if you'll type them right in the chat box. While you're thinking about that, let me just go ahead and let you know about the future webinars. Again, this was the first of 7. So the next one will be December 15th. it is going to focus specifically on those emergent readers, so those very first readers. That's going to be most critical if you are in, pre-K, K, and first grade, because generally those are the teachers who have those emergent readers. Sometimes they're, on up in our other grades, but typically by first grade we've seen them move out of that level. Then we're going to be spending a whole session on fluency, word study in February, comprehension in March, writing in April, and vocabulary in May. So every month we'll be getting back together to just talk about these different components of a balanced reading diet. One other thing that I wanted to show you, like I told you, the webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on the tree. If you're not familiar with the tree, it is on the West Virginia Department of Education website, and you can actually just go to the home, to the WVDE website, and go up in the search bar and type it in and find it. You can Google WV Tree. You'll be able to find it easily. But gosh, there are so many good things. I know here in this offices, we have been working to put a much cleaner version of the Teach 21 resource that there used to be. And so you're able to go right to your grade level and find your standards, find your different types of lessons to go with each of those, whether it's English language arts. This shows you that there's a resource to go with each one of these. So it's really a powerful resource, I think, and hopefully much more easily navigated than before. But this is where we will post the recording of this webinar. And I haven't seen any questions yet. I don't want to miss them. But if you do have questions, I encourage you. I am always available. And I'm honest about that. I've had people who call me at night, and I truly do not mind that. I've put my information out there because I want you to know that I'm committed to your success. I know you're committed to your children's, and I want to be there for you just like you're being there for your children. So this is my email address. That's my office number and my cell phone number. So anytime if you run upon something you're not sure what to do, you need some additional resources, please feel free to call me. I'm more than happy to help you any way that I can. Well, I haven't had any questions. Again, though, if you do come up on some, you feel free to email me or call me, and I'll be happy to help. Otherwise, I just thank you all for joining me today and sharing your time with me. I know your time is so valuable, and I hope you found this helpful. We'll meet back together again next month as we talk about those emergent readers. Thank you. You all enjoy your day.